Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
The Noble Mind podcast is brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy.
Hello and thanks for listening to the first episode of Noble Mind. I am Dr. Kate King. I'm a clinical psychologist, longtime meditator, and assistant professor at William James College.
And I'm Alex Gokce, a social worker with interests in trauma and mind-body approaches to pain management. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Susan Pollak, who shares about her pioneering work bringing meditation into psychotherapy. We also discuss self-compassion, parenting, reparenting ourselves, and more. Dr. Pollak has written several books, including Self-Compassion for Parents, Nurture Your Child by Caring for Yourself, and Sitting Together, Essential Skills for Mindfulness-Based Psychotherapy. She is co-founder and teacher at the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion at the Harvard Medical School and Cambridge Health Alliance. You can learn more about her work at Dr. Susan Pollak, spelled Pollak.com.
We hope you'll subscribe to this podcast and be in touch on social media. You can find us on Facebook and on Instagram at Noble Mind Podcast. You can get this episode's show notes, sign up to receive bonus content, and share your responses and suggestions with us at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, Susan. Thank you for joining us. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your work? How did you first get interested in mindfulness and meditation?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. And I feel like I have a rather colorful backstory in that I started meditating when I was in elementary school. My aunt was a journalist in New York City, and she was sent on assignment to cover the first guru who'd opened an ashram in the city. And this was, I'm dating myself, but this was the mid-1960s. And it really clicked for her. She started doing yoga. She started a daily meditation practice. And then she went to visit her mother, who's my grandmother, and her sister is my mom. And she taught us all, and at this point we were living in the suburbs of Boston. She taught us all how to meditate and do yoga. And there was something about it that really spoke to me. And as you can imagine, I've thought a lot about this, like what made it work. And when I tried to teach it, what was it that really spoke to me? And what I've been able to come up with was that it was really one of my first experiences of joy. I was at this point, I think it was 4th grade, 5th grade, 9 or 10 years old. And it was a pretty hard driving community. So it wasn't like there was much fun. People worked hard, a lot of striving, a lot of competition. I think it was really my first experience of just being able to relax. And I'd been, as a kid, suffering from migraines. I think part of it had to do with the stress of the family. And it just felt like a time when I could rest. And I think that was what really spoke to me. I hadn't had that experience. I know now in the meditation world, we speak of it as refuge. And I think it was my first experience of refuge and of just deep joy that wasn't really tied to anything. So that got me interested. My aunt was a very colorful character and very much a dedicated journalist. So as I got older, I would visit her on school vacations. And because she was very much a seeker, whenever I came, there would be a new teacher to meet, either a Zen master or a Swami or a Sufi master or a Tibetan master or a Sikh master. So whenever I came to visit her in New York, I would go with her or with her and my uncle and sit with these wonderful teachers. And this went on for years. So really throughout elementary school, middle school, high school. I did my first retreat when I was 16. And it was also a training in comparative religion, because it wasn't just studying with a yogi or studying with a Tibetan master. It was studying with basically all the swamis and gurus who were coming through New York at that time. And then I went on to study comparative religion in college, and then in graduate school, I went on to divinity school. So that it really became, they were deep seeds that were planted, and that really became my love and my passion.
That's really striking, especially as I'm thinking about our topic today, being parenting. Although in this case it was an aunt and an uncle, it still strikes me the influence that adults can have on children. And that when caregivers, whether it's parents or other family members or just adults, expose children to things, what a difference that can make in a child's life. That was such a gift they gave you.
Exactly. And not to be edgy, but I am a little edgy. I'm sure that if my parents had introduced me to that, I would have rejected it.
Right.
I think it really had to come from someone who, was connected enough to me, but not in a parental role.
Right. The benevolent mentor, teacher, extended family member, right, has a really important role, which it seems like it gets lost sometimes because people get so focused in their nuclear families these days, and the community or extended family sometimes gets lost.
Well, that actually brings up a wonderful point about parenting, which is most parents no longer have nuclear families too far away, or the nuclear family is no longer alive or unable to help.
Mm-hmm.
Us end up parenting in isolation. So while there are drawbacks to nuclear families, as a parent, if you're in a pinch, it's really nice to have a mother, sister, or brother come in and help out if somebody's sick or there's a crisis. And so many parents I speak to complain that they're doing it in isolation. And parenting, like so many activities, should be done in a village. And probably the village isn't a village of idiots, but a village of really thoughtful, loving, caring people.
You make some humorous and slightly irreverent comments about that village in the book. And what inspired you to write a book about parenting?
Well, my first book was really on bringing meditation into psychotherapy, because one of the ways I started this integration was I was in training as a young therapist, and like most therapists, I hit a wall, and I was sitting with someone and whatever I said wasn't working. And not only did I feel like I was, totally inept, but the client I was working with confirmed that indeed I was inept and I was stupid on top of that. And I was stuck, and I thought, okay, what am I going to do? And I remembered back to my meditation background. And I thought, well, I don't have anything to lose here. And I said to this client, how about, kind of at an impasse here, how about if we try something different? And she said, okay. And I taught her a very basic mindfulness practice. And fortunately, it helped. And she said, oh, I like that. That really helped. And I feel calmer. I feel less angry. I thought, great. But I didn't know what I was doing. Because at this point, I was in graduate school. It was in the early to mid 1980s. I was just really starting my training. And I didn't want to do any harm. So I asked one of my supervisors if she could supervise me while I tried this out. And she looked at me like she couldn't believe what I'd said, and said in what I will always remember as like the snottiest Harvard accent, in a very condescending voice, and excuse me for mimicking her here. She said, well, Susan, you can do whatever you want behind closed doors, but I cannot supervise you on that. And I felt like I had said, I want to sleep with my patient. I mean, I felt like I had really violated a taboo.
Mm-hmm.
And all I wanted to do was have someone to talk to about introducing some deep breathing or visualization in the therapy session. And I just wanted to be careful about it. And then now fast forward 30 years or so, and everyone's bringing mindfulness into psychotherapy. But then it was quite radical and seen as somewhat dangerous. And I think, just giving her the respect she deserved, because she was, very smart and very careful. She didn't want me doing anything that would be inappropriate. She was really, again, giving her all the credibility I could give her. She just wanted me to really hold the boundary. And she was from a psychodynamic, psychoanalytic background. And this mindfulness meditation stuff was weird.
So fast forward a few decades and it's not weird at all. It's on the cover of magazines and talked about quite regularly in many contexts and applications. So you're thinking about parenting these days, and what inspired that?
Well, so after, trying to integrate mindfulness and psychotherapy for a few decades, I was, at this point, my kids are in their 20s now and early 30s. So I'd been through the parenting roller coaster, and I knew how hard it was. And I was working with someone, and she was going through just a very difficult time, a nasty divorce. She felt like she was a terrible parent. There was a lot of self-loathing, and her kids were tough. Her kids were in adolescence. And being able to bring in some self-compassion made a big difference for her. And she said, Susan, there's nothing out there on this. You should write a book. And I thought, oh, okay. So there were other seeds in that I was looking to do something that would support people who were struggling. And this just came together. And I'm not sure I could have written the book when my kids were 4 and 6 or 2 and 4. I don't think I would have had that sense of trajectory that you get through parenting, through adolescence, through having your kids leave for college and leave home. And I think at that point I had the big picture. So those were the inspirations.
So you're coming to it both as a parent and a longtime meditator and someone who's interested in mindfulness, and as a psychotherapist.
And as a child. So I feel like I have all those pieces. I know what it was like to be a child and, to have parents who were well-meaning but screwed up at times. I know what it was like to make mistakes with my kids. After seeing parents for 30-some years, I could watch other people struggle. And then one of the things that always fascinated me about being a parent in meditation circles is that was lonely. So most of my meditation teachers did not have kids. I was reading something recently that the meditation teacher Seb Selassie said, which is that people often come to meditation centers before they have children. And then as their children are growing and they're active parents, meditation centers lose the parents, and then they come back, if we're lucky, afterwards. And I think that is because retreats are often privileged. And it's very hard for parents to take a week and do a retreat. It's hard even to have an hour or a half hour or 20 minutes of uninterrupted time. So people feel like they're bad meditators, or they feel like they've somehow failed. And I think if there were more meditation teachers who would say, okay, think of this as a different sort of retreat that you're going to do for the next 18 or 20 years of your life. Be a different sort of reframe rather than people feeling like, oh, I can't do silent retreats, or I can't reliably show up every Tuesday night at the meditation center because my kid needs me to help with homework or their parent-teacher meetings. So I guess part of it was hoping that meditation could be more appealing and more accessible for parents. And that's why so many of the practices in the book are short, 3 to 5 minutes or 3 breaths. Because it's really, unless you can get up way before your kids get up, you can wake up at 5 in the morning or whatever and meditate, it's hard to do it. If you try to do it at night, you usually fall asleep. So I think it's challenging.
Yeah, you do such a nice job in the book, sort of pragmatically talking about bringing mindfulness and meditation and meditative elements into daily life, into the sort of kind of messy, earthy reality of raising a family.
Yeah.
Spoken, and it really feels spoken from someone who's been there.
Well, and you don't want someone lecturing you on parenting if they haven't really done it. It's like someone trying to teach you to play tennis or whatever when they've never played, or they've just played for a year.
Your book seems designed for easy access and sort of quick, easy, practical tools.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted it to be easy access because most of the meditation teachers don't say, okay, if your kid's getting bullied, you can do this. Or if things are difficult on the playground or at soccer or at baseball, or if you're getting furious and you want to kill the Little League coach. And, for most people, parenting is a decades-long practice.
One thing you talk about is how overwhelmed so many parents can be, in this role. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about why you think that parenting and overwhelm are so predictably linked, generally or in these times, or yeah.
Well, it's a great question because I think we're spread so thin. If there are 2 parents and they're both trying to work, and most parents need dual income, and you're trying to take the kid or kids to soccer and ballet and basketball, there just aren't enough hours in the day. And then if, one of the kids is a talented athlete or a talented singer, then you want to supplement that. And most bosses don't like you leaving before the workday is out. So it's very hard, and it's also hard if somebody gets sick. So let's say you're working, your partner's working, your kid's sick, who's going to stay home? And again, not that many people have extended family, and it's hard to get a babysitter at the last minute. So that's a dilemma, and most people are just exhausted. I have a lot of people who start meditating and say, I fall asleep in 2 minutes. Is that okay? Well, you may be sleep deprived.
Yeah, I think when I started meditating, I fell asleep on the cushion predictably for almost the first 6 months or so. And then I realized maybe I should put myself to bed earlier, or something. So, and then it started to go away and it started to be easier to stay awake.
It's also overwhelming because kids need your time. And if you're spread too thin and juggling, you're not going to be present. Or you'll try to be present or pretend that you're present, and they'll see through it. I mean, I just remember a number of times that I'd be cooking dinner and, for example, thinking about a difficult client or suicidal client or some work dilemma. And my daughter would be telling me about her day. And I often pretended that I was listening or was half listening. And I'd go, during dinner. And then she'd say, Mom, you're not really listening. And she was right. And one of my friends who is, actually she's a minister as well as a parent who's interested in Zen, would talk about how her kids were like her in-house Zen masters because they were constantly saying, wake up, wake up, wake up. And kids do that in so many ways. They'll say, wake up, and it's 5 a.m, and all you want to do is just go back to sleep because you've stayed up late working. Or they'll just say, pay attention. I need you to be present. Don't be thinking about other things. Pay attention to me.
And I think sometimes we don't even realize we're not listening. We might even think we're listening, because we're so used to half listening through so much of our days, maybe that, you don't even realize it until someone kind of snaps you awake somehow.
And there's actually a great term that's come out of the tech culture, which I think is very helpful, which is, sort of divided attention or partially divided attention. So we'll do the same thing if we're on our phones. We're not fully present. We'll be looking at our email and trying to listen to a child, and we're not fully present.
Yeah, I think in the past people would hold that up as multitasking, and that's a great thing. But now there's more awareness of that's actually dividing something up.
The other issue that I'm hearing a lot about, and we never had this growing up, our parents certainly didn't have it, is the fear around school shooters. And that, I think, is a really difficult situation. And I'll hear from parents that they're worried about sending their kid to school. And often the kid is worried about going to school. And will say, well, what if there's a shooter? And you can't really say, oh, don't worry, honey. That's not going to happen. We don't know. So I think that's exhausting and stressful for parents and kids.
Yeah, the sort of day-to-day existential threats, that sort of come up when, you're just going off to school in the morning or something, but because of, what's been happening in the world, it starts to feel much more risky.
I'm a bit of a research geek, but there was an article, pretty sure the first author is Jean Quirk, Journal of Normal Psychology, 2019. And one of the studies she was looking at were showing that kids are more depressed and anxious than they've been before. And there's more suicidality, both suicidal ideation and actual suicide attempts than there were before. And the study actually ties the increase in anxiety and depression to kids being in school. So that's frightening.
Wow.
So how do you go about helping people cope with overwhelm, and how does mindful self-compassion come into play?
Again, I think mindfulness works, and there's another piece of research that brings this together. And I think what's a really exciting way, and I can give you that reference as well. And this is from study at Yale and professors at Yale, and they were finding that when parents learned to tolerate anxiety and discomfort, it was as effective as actually teaching children cognitive behavioral therapy. So often what happens is when kids are anxious, no parent wants their child to be anxious and unhappy, and they would rush in to fix it rather than teaching the child to be with discomfort. The discomfort is a normal part of life. And I think that's where some of the meditation practices can be so useful. Like, okay, just that basic practice of noting, like a pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And just because something's unpleasant doesn't mean you need to fix it immediately. You learn how to sit with it, and you learn that it will pass. And where the compassion helps is just bringing some warmth and kindness to yourself, because this is tough. When your kid's going off, you're worried, the kid's worried. How can you be kind to yourself? How can you not be consumed with anxiety? Because yes, the world is dangerous and we don't know what's going to happen next. but how can we be as grounded and present as possible without giving way to anxiety and panic? And that's hard. I mean, I don't want to be a Pollyanna here. There's no simple solution.
You're right about Dr. Richard Davidson, the neuroscientist's conclusions about how emotions can be trained and that we can develop a choice about how we are in relationship to them.
Exactly. So, I mean, just as we train our muscles going to the gym and lifting weights, I mean, we can really learn not to, as one of my meditation teachers says, not to get behind the anxiety, not to feed it. And a lot of people end up feeding it. And as we say in Buddhism, using the second or third or fourth arrows and just going into a catastrophic scenario, like, oh, I woke up anxious. Maybe something bad's going to happen. Maybe I should just stay home. Maybe I should let my kids stay home. So just really feeding that anxiety.
Can you describe those arrows to the uninitiated?
From my understanding, one of the original stories in the suttas, and the way I've heard the story is someone is walking and he's shot with an arrow, and a friend says, "Oh my God, you're shot with an arrow. Here, let me take it out." And he goes, "No, no, no, no. We have to find out who shot the arrow and what type of arrow it was. Was the arrow poisoned? And, why did he shoot the arrow at me?" So it becomes a whole long list rather than, "Yes, please, thank you, remove the arrow." So it's used as a metaphor when we make it worse. Like, just take the arrow out, treat it. Don't keep adding burdens, don't keep adding arrows.
And to be able to acquire that ability requires training our minds.
Right, because most of us tend toward adding arrows and going toward catastrophic thinking. And it's what Richard Davidson and others will call our negativity bias. And Rick Hansen says that the brain is wired so that we have Teflon for the positive experiences, they slip off, and we have Velcro for the negative experience. So we just hold on to the negative experience rather than just letting it go. And that is the tendency of the brain to ruminate as well. So when something bad or negative happens, it's very hard to say, and I like some of these phrases, that was then, this is now, let me start again, let me return to the present moment. It was like, well, that person said something and it hurt, and you can just keep going over and over and over again. And you're absolutely right. It takes training to say, you know what, I don't need to tell this story to myself again. It takes a lot of training not to keep replaying it. And the phrase that I find useful is asking yourself, is this serving me? And that can be one very useful way to break those ruminative links where we're replaying a story again and again. And if you say, well, no, it's not really serving me, then it's a lot easier to stop it. Then you can say, well, I guess I don't need to continue telling the story to myself over and over and over again. And, rehearsing what I would say and what I could do differently and wondering why this person said this.
And while these practices, meditations, the audio tracks are quite concise, several minutes long, they go to bringing about quite profound change in terms of the happiness and well-being of a family, because they impact things like decision-making, emotional flexibility, responsiveness, understanding.
It sounds like as you're talking about the sort of rumination and the worry and all the arrows and the suffering, this seems like the way that baggage gets developed. And one of the things you talk about in the book is baggage that people bring into parenting, stuff that they, come into with, from their own backgrounds and stuff. So I guess I'm curious how, if there's somebody listening who's wondering how do they kind of start to unpack their baggage and understand what they're carrying into their parenting or into their present life?
Well, obviously, I'm going to suggest therapy. And, that's one of the best ways to really look at what you're bringing parenting. And I see this so much, and I want to be light about this with parents and children. And one of my friends grew up, disguising people, of course, in a family where there wasn't much money, and she struggled, and she had 3 sons, and she said, okay, we're going to send you guys to college, but the deal is you're going to need to study either mathematics or computer science, and we won't pay for college otherwise. And what if the kids didn't want to study math or computer science? What if they weren't good at it? And it just seemed like it was more her anxiety rather than really looking at what made sense. And I have a friend who's a wonderful yoga teacher, very, very bright. And his parents wanted him to go to law school, and he was bright, and they really pushed, and ended up going to Harvard Law School, had no interest in it, never practiced. And as soon as he, finished the contract and graduated from Harvard Law School, he became a yoga teacher, and he did yoga and dance. And it was like, and then you can just imagine how many years of therapy that's going to take if parents force you to do something you really don't want.
And I imagine that, that's a great illustration with college, but that pattern in those families probably started much earlier about other things too.
Carl Jung has a phrase I like that I think is very profound. And it's basically that the biggest burden for a child is the unlived lives of the parents. You see that in all manifestations. You can see that in parents pushing their kids to be elite athletes, or, to be a lawyer, or to be an entrepreneur, because it's unresolved issues for them, or even simply just going to the school they went to, or going to a better school than they went to. And again, disguising identities here, one family member said very bluntly to his kids, if you don't go to an Ivy League school, it's not worth the tuition. And not all the kids, had the grades or SATs to get into an Ivy League school. And then what does it do to the kid who feels like, oh, I'm not good enough, I wasted my parents' money, I got a secondary education, inferior education, and I'm not good enough. I'm not as smart as my siblings. So that's a lot of baggage.
I was intrigued. You write that a child's ability to form a secure connection with the parent is connected to the parent's understanding of their own life experience.
That is actually the newer research that we've been finding, and a lot of that work is from Dan Siegel's work. And that was actually really the first I'd heard about that. John Kabat-Zinn, in his book on Ordinary Blessings, which was really one of the very first books on mindfulness and raising children, says something very similar. But I was delighted to see that in Dan Siegel's work, and that's from his Parenting from the Inside Out. So basically, and it's similar to the work we do in mindfulness, that you need to do your own work.
And it's not a luxury or self-indulgence at cost to one's child to to be working these things out in the parents?
I think it's an absolute necessity. I don't think it's an indulgence. Otherwise, you're just going to perpetuate the suffering that you had, which for so many people is unconscious.
Right. It's actually part of parenting, right? To understand oneself so that you know what baggage you're imposing on your kids. Yeah, so that you can minimize that. It feels connected also to what you've talked about in this idea of letting your child emerge, which also feels sort of like an antidote to imposing baggage, which is to have a certain curiosity towards, who is this child in front of me and what are they becoming and how do you encourage that?
One of the things I found interesting is people often have an intense reaction to that and ask a question that I find to be somewhat of a non sequitur, which is, well, what then if you're letting your child emerge, then maybe you won't set limits. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, the two don't necessarily fit. But I think that speaks to the fear people have if they're not setting limits and rules and just letting the child discover him or herself. That they're, they're not being good parents. And if you think about it, really, does self-compassion mean that you're going to let your child stay home from school and eat chocolate cake and ice cream for breakfast and watch Netflix? I mean, they don't add up. And the research from Christian Neff, I think, is important, which is we can motivate ourselves more with compassion than we can with criticism. And think of it this way. Let's say you got a bad grade on a math test. And if you bring it home and your parent yells at you, "You stupid idiot, what's wrong with you? You never get any place, you'll end up in the gutter, you're useless." Okay, how's that going to feel? As opposed to, okay, let's talk about what you can do to get those math grades up. And, it's really important to know math. And, could you speak to the teacher and get a little extra help? Just brainstorming with the child about how they can solve problems rather than just yelling at the child.
Yeah, the first one sounds like making the child feel bad about themselves, and also a short road to test anxiety or worse. Yeah. And the second one sounds like encouraging problem solving and teaching a skill for how do you handle a situation when you need to learn how to learn, basically.
I can't think of a better way to encourage math anxiety than to tell someone, "Oh, you're an idiot. You're not good at this."
Right. And yet you need to get an A+ on every test too.
I mean, it's setting the bar. It's making it impossible or so high.
So what would be another example of letting your child emerge? What might that look like?
One of the images I like is this story of Leonardo da Vinci, and what he would do before carving something is he would spend some time really looking at the stone and thinking, what does the stone want to be? What is it telling me? And I think, one way to do that with a kid is to really, basically, and this goes back to mindfulness, pay attention to the kid. Like, what makes the kid happy? What do they love doing? What makes them smile? So rather than forcing your kid to do something they hate, what would happen if you let the kid do something he or she loved and did it with them? There's a story in the book where this child was fascinated by animals in a museum, and he loved going to this science museum. He knew all the animals and, wanted to talk about the animals. And, one was a man-eating tiger, and that was fascinating. The other was a secretary bird, and he said, "Isn't that silly, honey?" And the dad said, okay, this is, a dog-eat-dog world, stop telling me about the man-eating tiger you're going to get if you don't do your math homework. And I said in therapy, well, what would happen if you, spend an hour and go to the museum with him? No, I'm too busy. I don't have time for that. And, I pushed, and he finally went to the museum with the child. The child was delighted because the dad was too busy to spend time with him other than dictate or check his homework. And he began to see an aspect of his son that he hadn't seen before. And he's like, whoa, he knows all these animals and show me this. And I mean, so there isn't just one way to survive in the world. And we were able to talk about how he could take these skills of memory and categorization and organization and apply them to all different sorts of things. But parents, I think, in their anxiety for their children to succeed, often have blinders. Like, this is the only way to survive.
So that's where the importance of play comes in, and why it should be prioritized. And how can children know if their children are playing enough?
Again, there's some really interesting studies on this, saying that we need play for our brains to develop. And there's some very important work that was done by Marion Diamond a number of decades ago, where they put rats in a number of different environments. And one was an environment where they had friends and toys. The other was an environment where they didn't. And they found that there was a big difference in the brains of these rats who'd had the enhanced environments. And I think it's very similar with children, that we need to play not only to develop social skills, but for creativity and for happiness. There's a recent, I can give you the link to this as well. It was in the New York Times Week in Review on how deprived children are with play. And they were saying that they were having the children get up an hour earlier so they could have an hour of play a week. And the people who responded was like, an hour of play a week and having to get up early? Like, what is going on? So I think because of budget cuts, so many schools are eliminating recess. Some are eliminating gym or music and art. So much of it, again, in some school systems is focusing on the test and teaching to the test rather than having more enriched environments. And that article, just so you know when I send it to you, is by Kim Brooks.
We'll definitely be putting each of these articles or a link to their abstract or something in our show notes, so that'll be great. So it's as you're talking about play, I'm just thinking about how important play is, like you were saying, to our cognitive development, our social development. And I'm thinking about, I think maybe if I'm an overwhelmed parent and I have this sort of feeling of scarcity around time and resources and energy, that it can feel like an indulgence or an add-on to make time to play or something, rather than to see it as an important part of the kid's development. So, and I'm also, as I'm saying that, I'm realizing that's how some people also end up relating to meditation or mindfulness or something like that's an add-on if I can fit it in.
Yeah, and the writer Audre Lorde puts it well. She says, she doesn't use the word self-compassion, she uses the word self-care. And she says self-care is not an indulgence. It's necessary for survival. And I think we don't realize that play, that time with friends, that relaxation is one of the things that makes us human, that gives us joy in life. And I think if we end up spending so much time competing, and again, focusing the classroom just on the test, really comes down to competition, who wins, who loses, who gets the big grades, I think we lose the sense of joy. And Teddy Roosevelt said it very well. He said, comparison is the thief of joy. And in Buddhist psychology as well, we speak of the dangers of the comparing mind. Because if you think about it, someone is always going to be better. Someone is going to win. Someone's going to lose. It's not a pretty picture.
I mean, you're right about how Many people imagine that when they run into difficulties, they imagine this isn't the way it should be, and my life is supposed to go smoothly, and it must be my fault.
So we end up blaming ourselves, or, my kids are supposed to be perfect. My kids are supposed to get all A pluses and be, star athletes and do all these wonderful things. And, generally it doesn't happen. And again, the research is that we can't control our kids and we can't make them into what we want them to be. So it might be better for everybody to stop trying.
So it seems mindful self-compassion is not only a way for parents to deal with the difficulties that they face in parenting, but also a path for them to reparent themselves.
Exactly, and that is one piece of research I'm really excited about. And a number of meditation teachers will speak of mindfulness and compassion as ways to reparent themselves, or build secure attachment if they've grown up with insecure or avoidant attachment. And one teacher in particular, Sharon Salzberg, who had an extraordinarily traumatic life, speaks of how she reparented herself through meditation and how her meditation teachers helped her reparent. And there's now research, Chris Grimmer may have spoken about this, that mindful self-compassion can help us reparent ourselves. So let's say, for example, you had a parent who yelled at you a lot, telling you you never amount to anything, you're never good enough. And these voices get internalized. So when, for example, you do something, it doesn't work out well, you break something or you get in an accident, those voices may come back and you may hear that voice that says, okay, you screwed up again, what's wrong with you? And then rather than accepting that voice, you could say, all right, Kate, human, we all make mistakes. May I be kind to myself? So that's a variation on the self-compassion break. So rather than accepting that negative message that I'm no good, you can continue to reframe that message.
So the childhood experiences of the parents no longer need to be fate, or they no longer need to be determinative in how their lives and their children's lives work out.
They're no longer destiny, and we can mediate and modulate them. So, because they can be so toxic. If your parent, for example, had a difficult, traumatic life, passing it on to you, you don't have to continue that.
You also write about hot emotions. I wonder if you can speak about those. What do you mean by them, and what are the ones that you see coming up in parenting?
Sure. So I think anyone who's been an adolescent or is raised an adolescent knows about hot emotions and arguments with parents. My favorite story here is a Zen story that I learned from Larry Rosenberg at Cambridge Insight Meditation Center. And a student goes to his Zen master and says, how can I basically get rid of this anger and these hot emotions, my rage? And the meditation teacher says, well, why don't you go to a place where there is no hot and there is no cold? And the student says, but there's no place where there's no hot and there's no cold. So the Zen master laughs and says, then don't make hot and don't make cold. So again, it goes back to training our minds. So noticing when we're making hot, when we're yelling at our child, when, for example, we're, icing our partner or icing our child. And if you start bringing awareness to all the times you create hot and you can create cold, you can step back from them and not perpetuate that cycle.
When you mention icing, you mean things like, quote, the cold shoulder or that kind of thing, distancing yourself, freezing people out.
If you're doing any sort of couples therapy, I'm sure you've heard stories of people not talking to the partner.
So you're referring to the stress response, or?
Yeah, sort of negative, angry, what we often call difficult emotions. I tend to put anger in with one of those difficult, hot emotions that we all deal with and often don't deal with as effectively as we would like to.
And as part of working with hot emotions, you've included the soften, soothe, allow
Right.
practice.
And that is also a good practice for shame as well. And my guess is Chris Germer may have talked about that as well. He's working on a new book on shame. And I love that practice because it takes in so many dimensions. So, you're working with your bodies, you're bringing attention to where that hot emotion might be in the body. You're sort of being with it, you're letting it soften, perhaps noticing how your fists are clenched, how your jaw is tight, how your eyes are tight, letting that soften. And you're soothing yourself. Oh, I'm angry. Doing that that wonderful technique of labeling. Oh, anger, 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 and not making it worse, not shooting yourself with that second arrow and yelling, anger, 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 anger. This is an emotion, it'll pass. And then just rather than wanting it to go away, just allowing it to be. Basically giving yourself permission to say, okay, these are emotions, they'll pass. Allow them to be here. Allow yourself to feel anger rather than making it worse or beating yourself up because you felt anger.
And then you have a reflection titled, Don't Be Pulled into Their Chaos, Pull Them into Your Calm, which intrigued me because I always assumed that if the person you're in relation with goes into the stress response, then it won't be long before I do as well.
Yeah, exactly. And this actually learned this practice. I'd stand up and do it with you, but it's sort of hard to do it, Mike. But imagine that you're at a subway station and the subway is taking a long time to come. Let me try it. See if you're standing up. Okay. So you're on the platform, the subway's taking a while. And what you do is you stand up, you're on the subway and you go like this. Impatience, frustration. And then the research is that within a few minutes, there are other people who are kind of stomping and checking their watches, muttering. So think of it as being contagious. So just as irritation can be contagious, I think having some equanimity can be contagious as well. Just simply breathing deeply, smiling, maybe even singing. If you're calm, people around you have a better chance of feeling calm.
So, Susan, we're thinking about starting to wrap up. Thanks for tackling the challenging topic of parenting, and I think many people will be helped by your work. If people are interested in engaging with you or your work or these ideas more, what could they do next? How could they find you, or what resources might you recommend?
First, president of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, and this is an institute that has lecture series and film series and lots of pop-up events for people interested in the interface of meditation and psychotherapy. Check us out. We have also started a center at Cambridge Health Alliance Harvard Med School, which is our Center for Mindfulness and Compassion. And we teach mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindful self-compassion. So that is a wonderful resource as well. In terms of my work, I have a website, Dr. Susan Pollak.
Excellent. We'll put all those links in the show notes, along with a link to your new book and all the resources that we've discussed along the way today. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening today. This podcast was brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the integration of mindfulness, meditation, and psychotherapy. For more information, visit meditationandpsychotherapy.org